Hello everyone and welcome to this watercolor painting tutorial for beginners. In this video I show you how you can paint a realistic rose with watercolors in only 5 steps. You can find a complete list of all my materials down in the video description, but you don't have to use the exact materials that I use. You can use any watercolor and watercolor paper that you have at hand. Your painting will just look a little bit different, but that's totally okay. In this video I will just talk about the technique and the steps that are needed to paint a rose in my art style. So let's start with step number 1. First of all, you need a good reference picture. I took this photo by myself, but you can also take a photo from the internet. Make sure you pick a photo where you have shadows as well as lighter areas. In order to create a convincing illusion of a realistic painting, the play between light and shadows is very important. So if you have a picture that has the same lighting everywhere, it will get a little bit difficult to render that realistically. In addition, if you take your own pictures, you might encounter that a lot of roses are really messy and it is hard to determine their individual petals. So I have hundreds of pictures of roses and only a couple of them qualify to make an artwork out of them, because all the other ones look really weird. Once you have found a reference picture that you are happy with, you have to transfer it somehow to your watercolor paper. There are several different strategies to do that. I personally prefer the tracing method because it saves time and I really want to put all my energy into the painting and coloring process and not into the drawing. But this is totally up to you. For example, when I want to draw something in my sketchbook, then I put all the energy in the drawing. But here, I just want to paint a watercolor painting and I want to start right away. So for me, tracing is the way to go. If you want to start with a drawing, then create a drawing first on a different sheet of paper and then transfer that to your watercolor paper. It is basically the same process, but the difference is to start with a drawing instead of a photograph. For my painting, I just print out my reference photo onto regular printing paper in the size of my artwork. I also print out the reference photo on photo paper so that I can use that as a guide while I paint. You don't have to do that. You can also just use your phone or your laptop while you paint. I personally sometimes like to look at a printed out picture because then I find it easier to compare values and colors. Once you have printed out your reference photo or finished your drawing, it's time to trace it onto your watercolor paper. I like to work with Fabriano hot press watercolor paper or Arches hot pressed watercolor paper, but this is just my personal opinion. You do you and you take the watercolor paper that you are most comfortable with and can work the best with. I cut down my piece of paper to the size of my artwork and I leave a small border around the reference photo so that in the end I have a beautiful little piece of art that has a white frame, and if a collector wants to frame it, they will have enough space around the artwork to do that. I use Scotch tape from 3M to tape down my watercolor paper onto a piece of wood. This helps preventing the paper to warp a little bit. It will still warp, but it definitely helps so that you don't have a completely warped paper in the end. It also keeps your paper in place, and as I just mentioned, it is necessary if you want to have this white frame around your artwork. And then the tracing process begins. I tape down my reference photo with regular tape on top of the Scotch tape, and then I put a sheet of charcoal tracing paper underneath my reference photo. Make sure that you have the right side up. It already happened so many times to me that I accidentally traced on the wrong side of paper, and that is annoying. To trace your reference photo or your drawing, be careful to not apply too much pressure and to use a sharpened pencil. If you apply too much pressure, you will have very thick black lines because this is charcoal transferring paper. When we want to have a light watercolor painting, this will really disturb the look in the end. If you have applied too much pressure, you can use the Scotch tape to slightly go over your paper and remove the dark lines on the surface. It will work to an extent. It helps lifting up your reference photo and the tracing paper during the process to control your traced drawing and to see if you have missed something or also if you have applied the right pen pressure. Step number 2. Fill in the blossom with a light base layer of paint. Depending on what color your rose or your flower has, choose the lightest version of it and fill out the entire area of the blossom. My rose comes in a super bright pink, so I mixed a little bit of neon pink and carmine to get a light version of the lightest color value that I could find in my reference photo. Most of the time we think the lightest points in our paintings or in our references are white, but this is rarely the case. Most of the times they are variations of many colors. They can be gray or pink or green, but most of the times they are not really white. After filling in the area of the blossom, I used a little travel hairdryer that I especially bought for my watercolor work to dry the rose. I'm relatively impatient and I really want to keep painting, so I use it a lot. After my blossom had dried, I fill in the background. I make sure to wet the entire area so that I can add abstract effects and splashes here and there. You can do whatever you want though. I like this kind of effect in my watercolor paintings and I work with abstractions to an extent because I think they are beautiful, but you can also fill the background with leaves or with the greens of the reference photo. I decided to go with grays and very muted colors to let the focal point of the painting pop out in the end. I didn't want my painting to be super intense green, so I experimented with a couple of colors and settled with mostly silvers, a little bit of gold, purple and green. You can add abstract watercolor effects in a variety of ways. For example, you can just use water and let it drip into the wet areas. This will create some really nice edges. Or you can use color and let it bleed into those areas. Depending on how wet an area is, the color will bleed more or less. So all your abstractions will look very different depending on what time point in your process you have added them, which makes watercolors so unpredictable and chaotic but also super beautiful. This is why I really love to work with abstractions and play around with them. Step number 3. Step number 3 is the most important step of the painting process because it focuses only on the rose blossom and it requires a lot of concentration and an eye for values. When you paint flowers, it is important to remember that flowers are very soft and the color values of a blossom are very close to each other. So it is very rare that you have a blossom and it has in the same petal very dark colors and also very light colors. Most of the time the colors are very close to each other, or at least the color values. And the higher the contrast is, the less realistic a flower can look. I made this experience after having painted hundreds of flowers, and the closer the values are to each other, the more realistic, soft and convincing they look. However, the color values that are very distinctive and that pop out have to be painted as well. So it is important to really observe your reference photo closely. There are also different ways on painting flowers, obviously, or painting roses. In this painting tutorial, I focus on only one way to paint them. And I decided on painting every single petal in this rose. And this is why I said in the beginning that the reference photo is important, because if you have a reference photo and it has hundreds of petals, it really might not be a very pleasant painting process painting all of these. So I picked a rose that I thought was definitely possible to paint if I decided to paint every individual petal that I could find in the reference. Also in the tracing process, I made sure to really catch every petal. Now, in order to get the rose as realistic as possible, I start by painting in the midtones first. I also make sure to use brushes that are capable of painting thin lines as well as filling in medium-sized areas. Very small detail brushes, for example, are only capable of making contours, for example, but you can't really fill in a larger area. So my favorite brushes that are really capable of doing both of these jobs perfectly are the brush series Neptune from Princeton. The round brushes are perfect because they have a very round body and a very small and tiny tip, which with you can go in the tiniest areas of your painting. They also hold a large amount of water, so you don't have to refresh you paint all the time. For this particular rose, I needed a very intense pink tone. Luckily, the Komoribi watercolor palette has a couple of neon colors that were perfect for this job, and I was able to create the exact colors that I could see on my reference photo. And this never happened to me, so this was the first time that I could paint a very intense bright pink, and it is in fact so pink that you can't see it in proper colors on the screen or on the laptop. Only in real life you can see the brightness. So I'm very impressed by the neon colors of the Komoribi watercolor palette. But if you don't have that, you can just use regular watercolors and your rose will look like a pastel rose, which is totally beautiful as well. So don't worry if you don't have the exact brand that I use. So back to the process. After having painted the midtones, I continued with filling in the dark tones. But painting only one layer of midtones and dark tones won't make a realistic painting in the end, so we are rather building lots of layers and add them on top of each other until we reach the desired color value. It is a rather complicated process, so having the reference photo at hand all the time and looking at it is super helpful for that. I like to squint my eyes or look quickly from my painting to my reference photo so that in the movement I can see on which areas I have to work in order to make it look realistic. Each rose has inherently more colors than we think. Even a pink rose or a red rose isn't just red or pink. But I started with just adding all the pink tones first, because I wanted to make the process easier and not so messy. So I started with filling in pinks wherever I could see them, and after I had filled all the areas, I concentrated on getting the color values right and worked on the darkest areas. So when you paint flowers, it is rare that you will find any blacks in blossoms, for example. So the darkest tone in this rose was a dark pink tone, so I added it wherever I could find it. I started with painting in the larger petals, then the medium petals, and then in the end I concentrated on working on the details. For the details of each petal, I used a detail brush by Neptune, and I try to be super careful when painting the edges and borders of each flower petal, because it is so easy to just paint what we think we see, which will not get us to a realistic result. If you want to have this realistic look in the end, we need to paint how it is on the reference photo. So it's not that each petal looks the same. Some petals have very light borders, some petals have dark borders. Many petals have folded borders, and then there's a little shadow under the fold, and depending on what position the petal is on the blossom, it is darker, it is lighter, there are shadows casting from petals around it on it. Then there's just so much going on every petal. It's definitely worth it to observe it closely and really only paint what you see there. For example, the middle of the rose, there's this weird little almost triangular shape where all the petals build like a whirl, and you have this funnel of petals that build the center of the rose. This looks different in each rose, so it is important to rely on a good reference picture. And now let's proceed with step number 4. You have already done the most important and difficult step by painting the blossom, and now we can concentrate on something easier, more lightly, that requires less concentration. It's always good to paint the most difficult parts in the beginning of the painting process, where you have the majority of your energy left, and then later on you can concentrate on the easier things. At least this is what I like to do. Again, I don't pressure anyone to follow the things exactly as I recommend them, because everyone is different and everyone needs to find the thing that works best for them and makes them happy. Because why are we doing art after all? Only because it makes us happy, right? Okay, and now after this philosophical insert, let's continue with adding the leaves and the stem of this rose. Now, you could paint those areas as realistic and as detailed as the blossom. Now, for this painting, I decided to only have one focal point in the painting, and that is this extremely bright pink blossom in the center, and I wanted to have everything around it very loose. So in order to realize that, first of all, switched my brushes and used a larger set of watercolor brushes, and I just played around a bit here and there and added some leaves where I thought they would look nice. This is not an exact science. Whenever you paint abstractions, you just have to follow your feelings and what you think looks good. Also, it is a matter of experience. So it is hard to explain where to add abstractions. It's really just a pure feeling, and I just paint something. When I like it, I let it there. When I don't like it, I lift it off with a lint-free cotton towel or a paper towel. For the greens of the leaves, I used the metallic green tone from the Komorebi watercolor palette. I used golds and I used grass green because I wanted to render the variety of colors. I also wanted to have a balance between sharp edges, beautiful watercolor abstractions, and the actual shape of the leaves. For example, I painted leaves, but then I would let one part of the leaf or one side be abstract. Or I would add the rose stems, but then the end of the stem I would blend into the leaves. Then when I have finished the leaf part, I let everything dry. Again, I use my hairdryer here because I'm so impatient. After we have finished step number 4, we can do the easiest step of all, step number 5, finishing the painting by adding a couple of beautiful splashes. I decided to add neon pink and silver splashes, and I think this is a great combination of styles. And if you are a beginner artist and you want to follow along this tutorial, don't have any expectations on your final artwork. It is always better to let yourself surprise and discover how your painting will turn out in the end. If you liked this video tutorial, you will like my step-by-step real-time painting lessons too. And if this video was a little bit too fast for you and you would like to see the process in detail, watch my 1 hour and 30 minutes long beginner watercolor lesson on how to paint a realistic rose step by step. Just support me on Patreon for only $5 a month and watch this and over 70 other painting videos. Each month I release new painting lessons for you, and you have access to all of them all the time. It's like a growing Netflix library, but for painting. Okay, and now those of you who have watched my latest video reviewing the Komorebi watercolors from Mozart might remember that I said I made a very interesting discovery regarding the neon colors. And I did. So since I am painting flowers, I always noticed that I was never able to recreate the exact brightness that I observed in my reference photo. Whether it being yellow roses or red tulips or purple irises, I never really seem to be able to catch the intense brightness of these colorful blossoms. And in the first time of my life, I was able to do that with using the neon colors of this palette. When I opened the palette, I thought, why on earth would I use neon colors and for what? I'm not going to paint neon paintings out of the sun, but this is not how I used them. Instead, I only applied a little amount of, for example, neon pink or neon red to add to the pink of my rose, or the other way around. I started with a very intense pink and then I added crimson red, for example, to tone it down a little bit, and this worked like a charm. It was so new to me that I could render those intense colors. In the past, I would suggest to buy acrylic inks, for example, to get this kind of intense brightness, because I didn't know that I could use neon colors as well. I just didn't have the thought. I just made this amazing discovery and I'm over the moon about it, because I always wanted to render super intense bright flowers, and I love the contrast between this extremely neon pink and the silver. And this discovery made the painting process even more interesting, and I can definitely imagine that I will use those colors in the future, maybe for other parts of my painting, whenever I want to paint something really bright and intense. This little study is available for purchase. If you want to give her a forever home, just follow the link in my video description to my online shop. I hope you liked the video and you found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next one. Bye bye!